everyone, hope you're doing well and enjoying your week so far. Hopefully you're enjoying your May. We've made it to the month of May, which the spring has seemed to fly by, at least for me. But hopefully you're enjoying the nice weather and just the changing of the seasons as well. This week is our last week of looking at stories out of the Bible that we may know, or maybe we don't know, but then asking ourselves, what do these stories mean for me today, kind of in my present reality, in my present situation? And the story we're going to look at today is a story about David. David was the second king of Israel, and he wrote many of the Psalms. But this story happens when David is pretty brand new into his kingship. Okay, this is one of the first things that happens to David when he becomes king. So when David becomes king, he has a couple of battles, which he easily wins because God has told him he will win. And what David does then is he takes the Ark of the Covenant, which had kind of been traveling around a little bit and never really had a permanent home, and David takes it to Jerusalem. And he's laying there at night, and he kind of says to himself, I live in this beautiful house, this beautiful palace, and yet God's presence, right, the Ark of the Covenant was kind of where God lived to the Israelites. It was his presence with them. Yet this Ark of the Covenant is living in a tent. And David thinks, like, that's not right. I should build God a house. I should build him a place where, you know, the Ark of the Covenant can stay. That's just as nice as the place that I'm living. And so David has this thought, and he tells Nathan, who's a prophet during that time. And Nathan has this dream or has this encounter with God. And God basically tells Nathan to tell David, no, don't build me a house. I've been traveling, or the Ark of the Covenant has been traveling with the Israelites for many years, and I've never lived in a house, always a tent. And he says this kind of one line that I want to pick up on, and he says, I have been moving from place to place. And what God's saying in that kind of, phrase, I have been moving from place to place, is that God can't be contained in one single place, in one single house. He's on the move. He exists and does his work in many different locations. And eventually David will receive this message. But what it kind of means for us today is we're living in a different time than we've all experienced so far in our lives. And sometimes it's hard to be away from things, right? It's hard to be away from school. It's hard to be away from church. And sometimes we can think of church, the building that we, worship and attend, as kind of God's presence maybe exists a little bit more there than in other places. And what God is saying in this story is no, like I move from place to place. I am present, yes, at church, but I'm also present at your school. I am also present in your home. And so for you today, to kind of think about what we can take away from this story is that God's presence, along with his love, along with his support, along with everything about God, is with you, right? God cannot be contained in a building. God's presence exists throughout our world, and especially with us now, as we live kind of in our separate little homes, in separate lives, at least physically, that God is with us all. He doesn't exist somewhere else. He doesn't just show up at church, but yet his presence is felt wherever we are. And that's what God is saying to David ultimately. He's saying, I have been moving from place to place. I'm not tied up in one location. Even though you can't go to church, doesn't mean that I am not with you. And so I think that's the biggest thing we can take from that story, is that God's presence follows us wherever we go. He moves from place to place. And so think about that as you think about this story. You can read about it a little bit more in our blog that we have this week on our website. And there's some discussion questions there as well that you can go through. Our movie this week is Jumanji. Now, there have been, I think, 2 sequels to Jumanji that have been made recently. That's not the movies I'm talking about. I'm talking about the original one that was made probably in the 1990s, so it's a little older, but it's still really good. What I want you to watch for in the movie is there's these two main children in the movie, and there's these two main adult characters who are not related. Okay, so we have this brother and sister, and then these two adults that kind of interact and ultimately wind up in the same situation together. And what I want you to watch for is we find out that the two kids, who are Judy and Peter, we find out that their parents have passed away. They're not orphans, they're living with their aunt, but yet they don't have a mom and dad around. And I want you to watch for how the adults, whose names are Alan and Sarah, how do Alan and Sarah care for, how do they relate to, how do they comfort Peter and Judy? How do they kind of show up out of the blue without knowing them and yet get them through kind of this game that they're playing, okay? Jumanji's a game, ultimately. But how do they care for these two kids? How do they care for them physically, but also emotionally? How do they show up to ensure that ultimately Peter and Judy will survive this game? And what I want you to think of when you watch it, or what are some characteristics, what are some emotions, what are some attributes that you see that are similar to your relationship with God? Where are some times in your life, or what are some things where God has gotten you through things, either physically or spiritually, emotionally? How has God showed up in your life and gotten you through moments of trauma, of difficulty? What are some things that God has done for you in your life that have gotten you through things? And maybe there'll be specific things in the movie that you can relate to, but maybe it's just a kind of this overall, how do these two adults, how do these two unrelated people get these kids through this movie? And then ultimately, how has God shown up and cared for me and gotten me through moments in my life? So that's it for this week. This will be our last video of the spring. We will still do some things this summer. They just won't involve these videos and lessons, but hopefully I'll be able to see you all face to face soon. If not, we will be in touch. So thanks. Have a great day.